nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we will bring up the volume. If we wish to make it softer, we will tune it to a whisper. We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical. We can roll the image, make it flutter. We can change the focus to a soft blur, or sharpen it to crystal clarity. For the next hour, sit quietly and we will control all that you see and hear. We repeat, there is nothing wrong with your television set. You are about to participate in a great adventure. You are about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to the outer limits.
All right. Excellent, excellent. I always think of Joe Stefano. Rest in peace, Joe. He was a really cool guy, and he was one of the creators of the original Outer Limits, and I got to meet him up in Vancouver in the script department up there at the redo of Outer Limits, and he was a real nice dude. So, want to mention at the beginning of the Liberty Conspiracy show, and if you're watching this later, packaged up for former Star Trek writing fellow on YouTube or on Rumble, please subscribe, share the links and all those things. This is going out live right now. And at the beginning of our Liberty Conspiracy show, I mentioned that we were going to be talking about someone named Winston. So I asked the live audience, who is that person? About whom am I speaking? And you can put your guesses into the chats and offer your thoughts on whatever it might be. And I think some people are going to get it right, because I did mention this man once before. Now, is he a real person? Is he a character? Is it Winston Smith? Is it Winston Cigarettes? I think I'm going to give you the heads up. We're talking about Winston Churchill. Now, there's a second question. Since this is June, and this is typically for Booktube, they call this June on the Range. If you watch Michael Vaughn, his channel, he's always a lot of fun. I love Michael Vaughn's channel. He reads Westerns, stuff on the frontier in the West, that sort of thing. Louis L'Amour, Zane Grey, whatever it might be, right? Okay, cool, right? Well, how can Winston Churchill be tied to a Western? Okay, let me show you a little something here, because if you go to Fantastic Fiction, which is one of my favorite websites, a great repository for information, you'll see if you do a search for Winston Churchill, there's Winston Churchill and Winston Churchill. Except the second Winston Churchill is Winston S. Churchill. That's the key. So let me give you the background here. We're talking about an American author at the turn of the last century named Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill wrote all sorts of stories based on the frontier, some revolutionary stories, and he lived in New Hampshire-Ansky, which is where I am. He was a massive bestseller, one of the best-selling authors in America for a number of years, and was well known. In fact, you might be familiar with the sculptor and artist Augustus St. Gaudens. Augustus St. Gaudens' place is just a few towns up from here, about a half hour away. Beautiful place, got lots of statuary there, beautiful grapevines there, great stuff. He had a large area of land, and he actually had sort of an artist's community where people could come up and stay. And Winston Churchill, the American author from New Hampshire, stayed there for a while. Winston Churchill lived at the same time as the Prime Minister of England, who did not write Western novels or frontier novels. That was Winston S. Churchill. Well, my father and I went into a bookstore one time in the town of Wilton, New Hampshire. Great little town. The Wilton Town Hall Theater is legendary. Dennis, who runs it, is great. Just the nicest guy. He's got great taste in music and movies. I almost said music first. And so Wilton town, very small town, just a little ways up from here. And in fact, I used to work at a farm stand that was partially some of their land was in Wilton. And that's where we used to fertilize the trees with nitrogen fertilizer, burn the skin right off your hands. It was pretty wild. But in Wilton was this little bookstore, terrific bookstore. And my dad and I went in. We used to go to bookstores all the time. Loved it. My dad read voraciously. It was awesome. And he had a bigger appetite for books than he did for food, I think. Although he had a bigger appetite for tea than he did for any of it. But we went in and I saw these books. Now, I knew that Winston Churchill had written a bunch of things. And back then, I had a much more positive view of Winston S. Churchill, the prime minister. Then I started to find out some of his background from World War I, some of the things that had to do with his background and, hidden writings with FDR to try to get the United States to get into the war and World War II, and not cool at all. Then, I became much more libertarian and completely opposed to the state. The question of whether England, needed to get into World War II and all the things that it did. Much more sketchy about Winston S. Churchill, the prime minister, as great as many of his speeches were and all those things. Okay. So at that time, I thought, well, I know Winston Churchill's written a history of the English-speaking peoples. He's done a bunch of nonfiction writing. He's got a glib tongue, all these things. I saw these books, these hardcover books by Winston Churchill. I'm like, whoa, look at all these novels by Winston. Hey, Dad, check this out. Wow, Winston Churchill. Well, the bookstore owner comes over and he says, there's an interesting story about that. I was like, really? He goes, yeah, that's not the prime minister. I said, it's not? I said, no. The guy's from New Hampshire. He lived around the same time as Winston Churchill, the prime minister. They actually corresponded with each other. I was like, really? He said, yeah. And the reason they did was because Winston S. Churchill wrote to Winston Churchill, the American author from New Hampshire. And he said, hey, you're probably experiencing the same thing I am. I keep getting your letters. And I'm sorry. I hope I'm sending them back sufficiently in time and so on and so forth. You're probably getting some of my letters that are supposed to be coming to me. He said, I tell you, here's an idea. One of us should use our middle initial in our writing from now on to differentiate between Winston Churchill and Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill, the American author, very popular, said, that's a good idea. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to seize the prerogative here. Since I am the elder, I will ask you to use your middle initial, Mr. Prime Minister of England, or whatever he was at that time. And to his credit, Winston Churchill, the prime minister, from that point on, always used his middle initial S, which is why when you go to Fantastic Fiction, which used to be .co.uk because they're based in England, you'll see Winston Churchill and Winston S. Churchill. Winston S. Churchill being the prime minister, Winston Churchill being the American. And there's his picture right there. There you go. Here you go right here. A little information from Fantastic Fiction. At the turn of the 20th century, Winston Churchill was the most popular novelist in the United States, the J.K. Rowling of his day. His second novel, Richard Carvel, sold a phenomenal 2 million copies, and his extraordinary fame forced the British Winston Churchill, the future prime minister, whom we associate with the name today, to use his middle name to avoid confusion with his American counterpart. From his early historical romances, Churchill moved on to political and social fiction. He was born in St. Louis, educated at Annapolis, and served in the U.S. Navy. His later fiction reflected his interests in social issues, and he was active in New Hampshire state politics, serving as a legislator and running an unsuccessful campaign for governor. That is Winston Churchill right there. There he is. Now, to let you know some background about Winston Churchill's politics, he actually was a progressive, sort of on the socialist progressive side of things. But at that time, the progressives, as you might know, weren't exactly complete Marxist progressives. There was the big labor movement at the time, which they often would claim that they were anarchists and so on and so forth. While they were statists, they weren't full-on Marxist statists or Rousseauian socialists. So he was a progressive. He wanted to have the so-called social safety net. He was very much in line with Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was a newspaper editor, actually lived in my town in Amherst, the town named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst, who wanted to give Indians mats that were infested with disease-carrying lice to try to kill as many of the Indians as they could. Yeah, the Royal Governor General, Lord Jeffrey Amherst. Unbelievable. But anyway, so Horace Greeley, newspaper editor, very well known for saying, "Go west, young man, go to the frontier," also lived in New Hampshire at that time. They both wanted the social safety net and so on and so forth. Now, it was unnecessary. If you read really good books on the history of voluntary associations, whether it's Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he came over originally to study the American penal system, and he was so impressed by the low indigency level and the high level of literacy that he wrote a completely different book about how voluntary associations were helping people and about how the literacy rate was really high without government-run schooling and all the arguing and all that stuff. He wrote that book, and other people have written tons and tons, whether it's more contemporary authors such as Anderson and the book, The Not So Wild, Wild West, about how the Western Territory guys handled their own policing and their own land claims and water rights and things without the federal government getting involved. They just did it voluntarily themselves. Property lines and how railroads were built without the government, and all these wonderful things that were done through voluntary association without forcing people to do it. Well, these guys, they didn't embrace that. They were much more towards the progressive interests of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so, I can't compliment Winston Churchill for that. But I want to give you some information about one of his books that I would like to recommend to you. And I also want to mention, as you see my super extendo Plastic Man arm, last week I talked about Howard Pyle. This is another painting by Howard Pyle. This is that book that I mentioned to you called Men of Iron. And part of the reason I want to bring this up is because, remember last week I mentioned Howard Pyle, his Merry Adventures of Robin Hood is such an incredibly wonderful story. And if you go to Rhode Island and you go to the Museum of American Illustration in Rhode Island, you'll see tons of his oil paintings. He not only wrote novels, he did his own paintings, he did his own sketches for the novels. He was very well known for doing art for magazines, and he instructed people like Wyeth, I believe. So a lot of wonderful art from this man, Howard Pyle. But I mentioned not only did he do great stuff regarding Robin Hood, and that is the definitive book, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. And there, as I said, there's a lot of history that indicates that there were various people who either took on the mantle of Robin Hood after an original Robin Hood in the 1100s in England around Sheffield, or there were people who were like that and they applied the name. But there does seem to have been someone like a Robin of Locksley type character, and then other people adopted it when they were fighting against the tax man as well. And but Howard Pyle has great stuff on King Arthur, and he loved knights, really loved knights, and wrote about pirates and all sorts of cool stuff for kids. Great adventures. And the reason I bring this up is, in addition to wanting to show you his amazing artwork, and you can see, I think this painting, I think, is on display in that Rhode Island museum. But this is a story that I mentioned last week, but I didn't show it. I got it out of storage and wanted to show it to you, because this is a story that, in a way, is actually very similar in theme to one of Winston Churchill's most popular novels, The Crossing. This is the very first book by Winston Churchill that my father and I picked up at that Wilton bookstore. It is a great story. It's huge. And similar in theme to this story is about a little kid who sees his father and he are visited by a knight who needs to stay with the family for a little while during the Crusades. And it's a really interesting story about how the kid learns about chivalry and hears about some of the man's adventures and some of the losses and things like that of a knight and what a knight was like during the medieval days. This little boy's perspective of this guy and his armor and the horse and all these things, the squire and all those things, working for the king and the royalty and all that stuff. A whole different world the kid hasn't experienced. Well, in the beginning of this book, there's a little guy named Davy, and they are visited by Daniel Boone. And it's a similar thing. He's a little kid. His mother has passed away. He's just with his father. And they live in the East, and they're visited by somebody during the Revolutionary era. It's 1774, and they don't want any part of either the royalty or the rebellion. They just want to be left alone. It's similar to if you get to see the Jimmy Stewart movie called Shenandoah. That's the position of Jimmy Stewart and his farm. It's one of David Knight's favorite movies, and it was written by a hardcore libertarian. In fact, there's a train in the movie called the John Galt in that movie. But this little boy has these sort of vague memories of this guy coming to visit and needing a place to stay. And he gets to stay with his father because his father's got an extra space. There's some work that's being done. This guy's moving west with a number of other people. And it turns out it's Daniel Boone. So you get these little appearances by these sort of classic characters. And whether or not it's a bit of hagiography and, star worship at the time, turn of the century of a guy that, he was a little closer to the Daniel Boone era than obviously we are. You keep that in mind as you're reading it. And they have this, it's almost like a quantum leap sort of thing where there are these particular figures from history who just suddenly pop up, that sort of thing. But it is very interesting. And it's a wonderful story about westward expansion told from the perspective of a person whose father doesn't want to be associated with either the revolution or the British monarchy. He just wants to live his life out in the Western lands. So while it's not exactly a Western cowboy story per se, if you can pick up The Crossing, you can get it. You can get it on Project Gutenberg has it because it's in the public domain. You can buy copies that people have taken and put out on Amazon. Various different people have put it out themselves with different typography and art. You might want to get one of those and you take notes in the margins or whatever. That's always fun. Great stuff. The Crossing is a wonderful one to start for Winston Churchill's work. And there are so many others like Richard Carville that, again, a 2 million bestseller, but he's almost forgotten. I think partially because of the Winston Churchill who became so famous in World War II from Britain. I think this author, Winston Churchill, is forgotten, and his writing is wonderful. Just in the opening of this, you'll see his descriptive powers are great. He describes the smell of bacon fat and the dust on a floor, a barn floor, and that sort of thing. The sunset of a particular afternoon when he sees Daniel Boone coming in, and the temperature and the smells around, and the dirt on the road, the dust rising up, and there are qualities that, especially now. As you know, if you're watching this show, and this is the former Star Trek writing fellow, that I have feet, more than 2 feet, I guess, in different things. So I do political commentary. I do work on video commentary. I do the streaming show of Liberty Conspiracy, which is a voluntarist, anarchist sort of show. And then I do writing. I write fiction and things like that. And I did script writing out west. Pun intended, I guess, pun unintended. But so it's interesting because as you see these very pressing, very intense stories, and the dissension amongst people who are thrust together in the tragedy of the commons, where their tax money is being taken, and they're trying to get the state steered their way or this way, and I mean state in the generic normative sense. You get a sense of being not just wanting to pull away. I don't necessarily need to pull away, but the world of translating the immediate world into something artistic that can be beautiful. And I don't mean to say it with too much, heaviness or pausing too hard on that phrasing, but there is something really, really great about thinking about reading something and sharing something beautiful, or being able to give it to somebody else. Whether it's a video of a cat doing something fun, or somebody feeding a parrot and something fun is going on, or a baby that does something amazing, or it's a sunset over some flowers, a butterfly, or a beautiful piece of written fiction. And one of the things that I wanted to mention in this video is, in addition to talking about Winston Churchill, and again, we probably wouldn't have agreed on a number of things politically. The same thing with my friend Captain Sensible, the guitarist for The Damned. We have a lot in common: anti-war, pro-animals, that sort of thing. He's for a social welfare program. We were driving in my car one time. We started talking about it. I'm like, yeah, but Captain, it gets gamed and then it gets misused. So he was like, yeah, but you you got to have something. He comes from the British side, which is much more anti-corporate. They understood the problems of corporate political connections, the whole thing with the enclosure movement and the favoritism of the royals, giving it to big corporate interests, that sort of thing. So he has a slightly different historical perspective on it than I do in the United States. But a guy like Winston Churchill, give him a shot. I think you'll like his stuff. And if you're looking for something for June on the Range and you don't want to go for maybe a cowboy story, although Louis L'Amour's stuff is incredible. You can literally read Louis L'Amour's books in the areas where the books are set and turn and follow the directions, because he was exactly right. He went precisely on that landscapes for all his stuff. Like, you can walk where he wrote the stories. But in addition to that, I just want to mention that as a person who only recently started to look at the Bible over the past few years, because I was teaching political philosophy and I started teaching Aristotle and getting into Thomas Aquinas and the prime mover and stuff like that, and because of various things that have happened to me that give me signals and tell me, look, you don't get physics from physics. You get physics from metaphysics by definition. You can't get physics from itself. Looking at the idea of being a creative writer, and I mentioned this to David one time, and hopefully this isn't too much pontification. I'll end it here. But I just want to mention one of the big lessons of reading creative fiction and not always reading nonfiction is we exist in a material world. The material world cannot create itself. Material world is telling you, it is manifest evidence of a creator, because it can't create itself. It's not possible. That's an infinite regress. That's tautological. It's a QED. It's an Ouroboros, to use E.R. Edison's terminology. And we'll talk about E.R. Edison in a future episode, which will be great. One of the greatest writers of all time, E.R. Edison. Wow, man. Wow. But I mentioned to David that the process of being able to envision a fictional world in your mind, to get the words of a person who wrote the story and put them in your mind and see them, is a process that also allows you to realize that the material world around you, that there can be something else out there. And maybe some people think that that's too much of a stretch of the imagination, but let me put it this way. Writing is a creative endeavor. That's, of course, why they call a person like me, or a person like Winston Churchill, or a person like F. Paul Wilson, or Tom Monteleone, or Edgar Allan Poe, or whatever, a creative writer. You're creating something with the words. And it's not just stringing words together. It's also stringing words together in a pattern that is satisfying, in a sentence structure that is satisfying, in a paragraph form that is satisfying, in chapter forms that are satisfying, in psychological terms that give satisfaction in understanding the people, that connect perhaps with certain things that other people have seen or they've experienced themselves. Creative writing is the act of creating something, and it is a mimicry on the human side of as far as we can go within storytelling to what God does with everything that God creates. God creates. God is the creator. And we as creative writers hope to do something similar. And I hope that in doing that, in all of my writing, which is what I'm trying to do piece by piece, to put everything together, to lead people to logos, to realize that if they can read these things and realize that there is a creative writer who's just creating fiction and it's not material, and they can recognize that it's being read on material, then we're merely mimicking what a creator really did for us. And I don't want to sound too sentimental or, too saccharine or religious or anything like that, but it is interesting to consider the process of being a creative writer, aspiring towards allowing pictures to arise in the reader's mind and to get a message and to talk to people about these things. And then realize that we are manifestations of the real creator, which I think is really interesting. And an amazing blessing. And sometimes you wonder, like, why? Wow, amazing. So we're all given the opportunity to experience this world, and hopefully we're doing things that, we're asking questions of God. Am I doing the right thing? And hopefully you're recognizing some signals here and there. And again, for people who are skeptics, just remember, it's impossible really to be agnostic if you recognize that the material world can't create the material world. You don't get physics from physics. So with that stated, we'll show you another picture of a man, another creation of God, Winston Churchill. And I'll recommend the book, The Crossing, if you want to see what life was like as people headed west and see some guest appearances by some very interesting people. And there is a very interesting revelation in this story at the end. So you'll want to check it out. You can also get the audio version at LibriVox. Just look up LibriVox, Winston Churchill, The Crossing. You'll see his books are read by many people. And you can even increase the speed to like 1.25 or 1.5, and you'll still enjoy it. So with that said, everyone, I hope you had a great night. And thank you for watching. Former Star Trek writing fellow. We'll talk script writing again in about for the first time, I should say, in about a couple weeks. And we'll also talk more great fiction. We'll go into E.R. Edison. We'll talk some Edgar Allan Poe and talk about book collecting as well. I really appreciate everybody being there. And thank you, everyone, for heading over to my Substack as well. And that's a little incongruous bringing that in, a little tangential, but head over to the Substack. You'll see more. And I'm going to start a separate channel on that Substack for the fiction writing conversations and the posts and things like that. We'll get around to that after I do the stuff here in Russia, Hampshire, taking care of the links. I should show you the links as well, but they're out. I don't know. They're probably chilling. They're reading some Winston Churchill right now. So thanks, everybody. I'll leave you for the whole show for Liberty Conspiracy and former Star Trek writing fellow. Remember, you can contribute. You can help over at Substack. When the audios of Liberty Conspiracy go out, you'll see the PayPal. You can contribute while we're going live at Rumble for Liberty Conspiracy, and you can contribute by becoming a subscriber at my Substack as well. And and sometime we'll have to do a live show for former Star Trek writing fellow. That'll be a lot of fun. I think that'll be cool. And I'd love to get your ideas on your favorite authors. We'll open up the lines sometime and do a live show about that. That'll be cool. In the meantime, I'll leave you with science fiction. I turn control over to you. Have a great night. God bless.
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to the outer limits.